I need to tell you about the afternoon I was sitting at my kitchen table, going through old invoices, and my neighbor knocked on my door with a plate of food she said she had made too much of. And I said thank you and thought nothing of it. And then she did it again 3 days later and again 4 days after that. And somewhere around the 6th time it happened, I sat with the plate in my hands after she left and asked myself a question I had been very carefully not asking. The question was, how much food is a person allowed to make too much of before it stops being an accident? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I go on, if you've ever had someone be kind to you for so long and so consistently that you eventually had to ask whether kindness was the only thing it was, leave a like. Because that is the exact thing that happened to me over the course of about 4 months in Portland, Oregon, and I did not handle the realization gracefully. Her name was Renata Flores. She had moved into the house next door to mine about 14 months before any of this happened. She had come from Sacramento after her husband passed, a man I never met but whose name, Daniel, I would come to know the way you know the names of people who shape someone you care about. She had 2 adult children who called on weekends and visited at holidays. She had a garden along the left side of her property that she tended with specific, unhurried attention. She had a laugh that was low and real and arrived without warning. She was 46. I was 43. We were neighbors in the specific Portland way of people who live in older houses on quiet streets with good trees and a general agreement not to be intrusive. We had introduced ourselves properly when she moved in, exchanged numbers for the practical reasons neighbors exchange numbers, trash pickup schedules, the occasional parking question, and then settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who wave and sometimes talk across the fence, but do not make demands on each other's time. That was the version of things I had in my head for the first several months. Friendly neighbors, adults who respected each other's space, people who occasionally had a brief conversation across a fence about the weather or the broken streetlight at the end of the block. Then the food started. The first time was in November, a Tuesday evening, just after dark. I had been working from home all day and had not eaten properly, and was standing in my kitchen looking at a refrigerator that had very little going for it. The knock came and I opened the door, and Renata was standing there with a ceramic dish covered in foil, wearing the slightly sheepish expression of someone presenting a thing they had decided to bring, but were now second-guessing. She said she had made a big batch of pozole, and her kids were not visiting, and it seemed wrong to let it sit. I said thank you. She handed it over and said goodnight, and went back next door. I ate the pozole at my kitchen table, and it was extraordinary. The kind of food that makes you sit still for a moment after the first bite, because it is better than you expected, and you want to give it the attention it deserves. I thought that was a kind thing to do. I thought she probably has too much food in general, living alone. I thought I should return the dish. I returned it the next afternoon. She answered the door in work clothes, reading glasses pushed up on her head, looking like someone who had been in the middle of something. She took the dish and said she was glad I enjoyed it. I said it was the best pozole I had ever had, which was true. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I did not examine closely enough at the time. And then she said she would keep that in mind and went back inside. I went back inside too and thought nothing more of it. This is the part where I should have been paying better attention. 3 days later, chicken with rice and roasted peppers. 4 days after that, a container of black bean soup with a small bag of torn bread tucked beside it. A week later, enchiladas, still warm, the kind that take time and do not happen by accident. Each time she said some version of the same thing, that she had made too much, or that the recipe was meant for more people than one, or that she had been in a cooking mood and did not know what to do with the results. Each time I said thank you and meant it, and told her it was delicious because it always was. And each time I returned the dish, there was a brief exchange at the door that I had started looking forward to without examining why. My friend Dennis noticed before I did. He came over on a Saturday in late December, and I had just finished a container of tamales that Renata had brought the day before, and he picked up the ceramic container from the counter and turned it over in his hands. Whose is this? My neighbor's. He looked at the container, then at me. How often does your neighbor feed you? I thought about it. Fairly often. How often is fairly often? I counted back mentally and arrived at a number that surprised me slightly. Probably 6 times in the last month. Dennis set the container down. He had the expression of someone watching a slow-moving situation and choosing whether to intervene. He was a good friend, which meant he did not always say what he was thinking. He was also an honest friend, which meant he sometimes did. Does she make too much food a lot? He asked. That's what she says. Dennis looked at the container again. Then he looked at me with the specific patience of a man who had decided to let me arrive at the conclusion myself. He did not say anything else about it, but after he left, I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes and thought about the 6 times in the last month. I thought about the food, which was always good and always warm, and always slightly more than one person strictly needed to bring over. I thought about the way the conversations at the door had been getting a little longer each time. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say that is the moment things changed, but longer in the way that things get longer when 2 people are not in a hurry to end them. I thought about the expression on her face when I told her the pozole was the best I had ever had, the one I had not examined closely enough at the time. I went to bed that night with more to think about than I had expected a Saturday to produce. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever misread kindness as only kindness because it was easier than acknowledging what else it might be? Leave a yes or a no in the comments. Because I had been doing exactly that for 4 months, and I was beginning to understand the shape of it. January came in cold and gray, the way Portland Januaries do, with low clouds and the kind of rain that does not perform, but simply settles in as if it has always been there and plans to stay. I had a work project that was taking more hours than I had budgeted for. I was spending long days at my desk and not getting out much. Renata had not brought anything over in about 2 weeks, which I noticed more than I was prepared to admit. Then, one afternoon in the 2nd week of January, I was clearing ice off my front steps after an unusual overnight freeze, and she came out of her house with her own scraper and started working on her walkway. We worked in parallel for a few minutes without talking. The street was quiet. The ice came off in satisfying pieces. Then, she looked across at me and said, "You look tired." "I probably am," I said. She leaned against the railing. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and she had a scarf in a dark rust color wrapped twice around her neck. She looked like someone who was entirely at ease in winter, which was a thing I found interesting about her. "Are you eating?" she asked. "I am." The question had a lightness to it, but not a careless one. "I've been busy," I said, "not cooking much." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, with a small and specific directness that I was entirely unprepared for, I could fix that. The ice scraper was in my hand. The street was quiet. The rust-colored scarf moved slightly in the January wind. I looked at her. I mean, really looked at her, which was a thing I had apparently been avoiding for 4 months. Renata looked back at me steadily, not waiting, not pressing. Just present in the unhurried way, she was present at everything, like a woman who had learned that patience was not weakness. I said, "I think I've been misreading things." Her expression shifted. Something in it went a degree more careful. "What things?" she asked. "The food," I said. "The 6 times last month." The conversations at the door that I told myself were just neighborly. She was quiet. "I've been calling it all kindness," I said, "and I think I did that on purpose." She looked at the ice she had been clearing, then back at me. "And now?" Now I'm not sure that was accurate. She was quiet for another moment. The street settled around us, cold and still. Then she said, "Daniel died 2.5 years ago." She said it the way she said most things, directly and without armor, but I heard the weight in it. I spent the first year not wanting to be anywhere, the second year learning how to want things again. She paused. "When I moved here, I was not looking for anything. I was just trying to build something manageable. I waited. She looked at me. You were easy to be around. You didn't push. You didn't perform concern. You returned my dishes and said please and thank you, and you meant both. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. I told myself I was just being a good neighbor. I found I had nothing clever to say. That happened occasionally. Usually when something was too honest for cleverness. How long? I asked. She tilted her head. Since the pozole? I nodded. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrives quietly and means more than it announces. About as long as you would think. I stood on my front steps in the January cold with an ice scraper in my hand and thought about 4 months of warm food and conversations at the door, and a ceramic container I had returned 6 times, and a woman who had been making too much, food with entirely too much consistency for it to be anything other than what it was. I thought about the expression I had not examined closely enough when I told her the pozole was the best I had ever had. I thought about Dennis and the container and the specific patience of a good friend who had said nothing else. I have not done this in a long time, I said. She looked at me. Neither have I. It seems important to say that correctly. She nodded. Yes. So, I looked at the cold street, the quiet houses, the gray January sky. Would you like to have dinner with me? Not the kind where you cook and bring it over. The kind where we both go somewhere and it is on purpose. She held my gaze for a moment. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Then she said, I've been waiting for you to ask that since October. October, 2 months before the pozole, before the chicken and rice and the black bean soup and the enchiladas that took time and did not happen by accident. I laughed. I should have asked in October. You were being careful, she said. It's not the worst quality. I stepped down off my porch and crossed the small distance between our properties. She did not move back. I'm sorry it took me until January. She looked up at me, the rust scarf between us and the cold morning all around, and said, Winter is a good time to start things. Everything is already stripped down to what it actually is. That was Renata. She said things like that and meant them completely, without performance, without trying to sound like anything other than a person who had learned to say true things, simply because she had discovered that the complicated versions didn't protect you any better. We went to dinner the following Friday, a small Italian place in northeast Portland that she had been to before, and I had not. She ordered without looking at the menu for long, which meant she had been here enough to know what she wanted, and I found that detail charming in a way I could not fully explain. We talked for 3 hours. Not about grief, not about loneliness, not about the careful months before. We talked about the things that make a person make sense, where they grew up, what they cared about before they had the language for it, what they were still figuring out. She told me about Sacramento and her children and the garden she was slowly learning to call her own instead of something she had inherited from her previous life. I told her about the project I had been working on too long and what I actually wanted to do when it was finished. At the end of the night, walking back to our cars in the cold, she put her hand in the crook of my arm, the way a person does when it has already become natural. I should have asked in October, I said again. She looked straight ahead and smiled. You asked in January. That's what happened. I looked at her. That's very forgiving. She considered that. It's practical, she said. I can't change October. I can have this January. I thought about that for the rest of the drive home, about the particular freedom of a person who has already learned that time does not wait, and that the honest thing now is worth more than the perfect thing later. When I pulled into my driveway, she was pulling into hers. We walked up our separate front paths in the dark, and she stopped at her door and turned. Good night, she said. Good night, I said. Renata. She smiled at the specific way I had said her name, as if I was finally using it correctly. Then she went inside. I stood on my own porch for a moment. The street was quiet. The winter air was cold and clean. The ceramic dish she had given me in November was still in my kitchen cabinet, because I had stopped returning it after the fourth or fifth time, and she had stopped asking for it back, and neither of us had said anything about what that meant. I went inside and thought about how you can share a fence with someone for 14 months and wave and talk about the weather and call it neighborly while something else entirely is building on both sides of the property line without either of you naming it until January. And I thought about how some things are patient, how the right ones do not announce themselves with urgency, but simply continue showing up, warm and consistent, until you have no more reasons left to call them something smaller than what they are. 2 months later, Dennis came over again. He looked at the counter. He looked at the stack of 3 ceramic containers she had not taken back and I had not returned. He picked up the top one, turned it over, and looked at me. "So," he said. "So," I said. He set it down and smiled the smile of a man who had said nothing in December and did not need to say much now. "Good," he said. "Yeah," I said. "It is. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. And if you know what it feels like to finally let yourself see the thing that was in front of you all along, subscribe." The next story is already waiting. If you made it to the very end, comment. She made too much on purpose.